A rusted iron chisel slipped, slicing into Gideon's calloused thumb, but the overseer's whip barked louder than his bleeding flesh. Under the towering shadow of ironclad fortress, 19-year-old Gideon carried 60-pound slabs of damp granite until his spine felt like splintered oak. He was nothing here, just a ghost in sweat-stained burlap. An unpaid laborer destined to be buried beneath the very foundations he poured. Every evening, while the stonecutters and merchants drank cheap ale to numb their broken bodies, Gideon collapsed onto a bed of rotted straw in a drafty stone lean depressed against the outer wall. His mind burned with a suffocating question. Why did the men in silk robes hold the blueprints, while men like him were condemned to carry the weight? One freezing November twilight, as bitter winds whipped down from the mountains, an elderly traveler sat near the quarry's dying embers. It was Elder Corvus, a wandering scholar whose patched woolen cloak smelled of old parchment and wood smoke. Gideon offered the old man his last sip of stale water. Corvus looked at the young man's bruised knuckles, then at the massive fortress towering in the dusk. He leaned close, his voice cutting through the howl of the wind like a sharpened blade. The world gives the exact same pitch-black darkness to the duke and the ditch digger. Young man, but the fool sleeps through it, while the master claims the quiet hour before dawn. Gideon frowned, wiping cold sweat from his forehead. What good is the dark to a man who owns nothing? Corvus picked up a piece of charred willow wood and pressed it into Gideon's palm. Daylight brings the noise of overseers, judgment, and your own desperation, but at 5 in the morning, the universe belongs to no lord. In that silence, your mind is a sanctuary. Wake up at 5, and you will construct a destiny no king can tear down. The words echoed in Gideon's chest like a bronze bell. That night, as 30 exhausted laborers snored in the freezing dark, Gideon didn't yield to his aching limbs. When the cold air settled into a dead, absolute stillness, long before the first rooster crowed or the quarry horn screamed, his eyes snapped open. The air was 32 degrees, biting his lungs. His muscle-sore body screamed at him to stay beneath the thin wool blanket. But the ghost of his future pulled him up. At exactly 5 a.m., in the pitch-black silence of the frozen lean-to, Gideon struck a flint. A tiny yellow flame flickered on a dish of saved animal grease. He sat on the dirt floor, his knees trembling from the cold, and held the charred willow stick over a broken piece of flat slate. He pulled from his pocket a crumpled piece of paper he had scavenged from the royal trash heap, a tax ledger marked with strange, precise symbols. While the entire kingdom slept in comfortable ignorance, Gideon took his first breath of freedom. With raw, freezing fingers, he began tracing the symbol for the number 10 onto the slate. Stepping across the threshold from a life of forced labor into the untouched sanctuary of the dawn. Day after day, while freezing fog clung to the riverbank and the rest of the fortress slept, Gideon ignited his grease lamp at 5 in the morning. Through 3 brutal winters, the stillness before dawn became his furnace. He scraped copper wire against slate to learn geometry, mapped pulley leverage ratios with charcoal on hemp paper, and traded his scarce bread rations to borrow a merchant's brass compass. By day, he hauled granite under the blinding sun, his shoulders scarred and bleeding. By dawn, his mind dissected the mechanical architecture of the kingdom, Elder Corvus appeared periodically in the quiet twilight, watching from the shadows as the ignorant laborer transformed into a master of unspoken principles. "The daylight world demands your sweat, Gideon," Corvus whispered one freezing dusk, inspecting a meticulously drawn bridge blueprint on Gideon's floor. "But the quiet dawn demands your soul." Then, catastrophe struck. A torrential 5-day storm unleashed a mudslide from the upper ridges, smashing the central stone archway of the river aqueduct, the fortress's sole supply of clean drinking water. Torrential, icy water flooded the lower district, threatening to undermine the entire city wall. The Duke's master architects stood on the roaring riverbank, their velvet robes soaked in mud, arguing helplessly over collapsing timber scaffolds and snapping hemp ropes. They faced a 48-hour deadline before the city's water reserves depleted completely, and panic tore the gates apart. Stepping straight out of the crowd of trembling laborers, Gideon pushed past the armed guards. His boots sank 4 inches into the freezing slime as he dropped a heavy stack of waterproof parchment onto the chief engineer's table. "Your timber braces are placed at 30-degree angles, which transfers the stress directly into the soft clay," Gideon said, his voice ringing with cold, absolute precision over the roar of the river. "If you set 3 iron-reinforced trusses at 55 degrees anchored to the bedrock, the load will balance within 2 hours." The chief engineer sneered at Gideon's filthy burlap tunic. "You carry rocks, boy. Who taught a dog to calculate stone loads?" Gideon picked up a heavy iron sledgehammer, swung it with trained precision, and drove a steel pin directly into the exposed granite bedrock at the exact angle from his dawn diagrams. "The dark taught me," Gideon replied, looking the engineer dead in the eye. "Implement these calculations now, or watch your fortress fall by noon." The chief engineer stared at the flawless mathematical proofs drawn on the parchment, his jaw tightening in shock as he realized the illiterate quarry laborer had solved the crisis that stumped the court. Driven by desperation, the engineer barked orders to follow the laborer's blueprint. For 18 straight hours, Gideon led the construction team through the freezing spray, positioning iron beams with terrifying accuracy. As the sun reached its peak, the structural timbers locked tightly into place, the roaring torrent was redirected, and the aqueduct stood firm. The Duke himself rode down to the muddy bank, his golden spurs gleaming in the sunlight, dropping to his knees before a man who used to whip his back. The chief engineer handed Gideon a leather pouch heavy with 50 gold sovereigns and a silver seal of senior architect. Gideon held the silver badge, smelling the familiar smoke of his morning oil lamp. Knowing this was only the first milestone of his discipline, he turned to Elder Corvus, who stood smiling at the edge of the roaring river, and made a firm, irrevocable vow. He would take these gold coins and build a grand university of the dawn, proving to every forgotten laborer that their true power waited in the silent hour before sunrise. With his newfound authority and 50 gold sovereigns, Gideon did not buy silk robes or a mansion on the hill. Instead, he purchased an abandoned stone barn at the edge of the quarry. 10 years passed, and while the city expanded into a roaring hub of commerce and steel, 50-year-old Gideon remained unshakable in his sacred ritual. Every morning at precisely 5 a.m., as freezing 35-degree mist rolled over the cobblestones and the stars still shone like crushed diamonds. His lantern flickered to life inside the massive stone hall. He had transformed the drafty structure into the Hall of the Dawn, a sanctuary of higher learning with vaulted ceilings and walls lined with slate chalkboards, brass astrolabes, and hundreds of hand-bound books. One freezing winter morning, while the entire city remained buried under heavy wool blankets, a 12-year-old orphan girl named Eliana stood outside the hall's iron doors. Her bare feet blew from the frost and her fingers trembling around a stolen piece of chalk. She had watched Gideon from afar, wondering how a former quarry slave became the grand architect of the realm. Gideon opened the heavy oak door, the scent of burning pine oil and parchment wafting into the cold air. Without a word, he draped a thick woolen cloak over her shivering shoulders, handed her a brass compass, and pointed to a clean slate board illuminated by a single tallow candle. "The world will tell you that your birth defines your boundaries," Gideon said, his calm, resonant voice cutting through the stillness of the dark hall. "They will tell you to wait for daylight, for permission, for a benefactor, but at 5 in the morning, there are no masters, no critics, and no barriers. The silence belongs to those who claim it." Tears streaked through the soot on Eliana's cheeks as she pressed the chalk against the slate, tracing her very first geometric circle in the quiet sanctuary of the dawn. Standing near the arched doorway, Elder Corvus leaned on his smooth oak staff, his weathered face creased with a profound, quiet pride. The old scholar looked at the dozens of young laborers and street orphans sitting in the dim lamplight, calculating structural loads and mapping celestial movements hours before the city horn sounded. Corvus stepped up beside his former student, whispering over the scratching sound of chalk on slate. "You did not just escape the quarry, Gideon. You built an empire out of the hours the world threw away." Gideon turned toward the arched window as the first golden rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, illuminating a new generation of minds waking up to their own power. He picked up his original charred willow stick, handed it to Eliana, and delivered the final, undeniable truth of his life. Genius is not born under the blinding sun. It is forged in the silence before the dawn. And that sacred hour is waiting for anyone brave enough to claim it.